Sometimes the most profound lessons come from the smallest teachers. In 1885, Apache warrior Nashoba thought he had seen everything life could throw at him until a 10-year-old girl changed everything he believed about strength and tradition. Rose was just an orphan child when she arrived at the Apache camp, but she carried something remarkable inside her. When she asked to learn the bow, Nashoba laughed. What could this little white girl know about Apache ways? But Rose had a gift that would soon silence every doubter in the tribe. Her arrows flew straighter than seasoned warriors. Her determination burned brighter than the desert sun. And when the annual games arrived, she did something that no one had done in 50 years. What did this remarkable child accomplish that left an entire tribe speechless? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the red canyon walls as Nashoba walked the perimeter of the Apache camp, his weathered hands gripping the war lance that had belonged to his father and his father's father before him. The ceremonial weapon, carved from mountain ash and decorated with eagle feathers earned in battle, represented everything he held sacred about his people's way of life. At 58, Nashoba had seen more changes than any warrior should witness in a lifetime. The buffalo herds had vanished. The cavalry posts grew larger each year. And now, fewer young men showed interest in the ancient skills that had kept their people alive for countless generations. The camp itself sat nestled in a protective bend of the canyon, where natural stone walls provided shelter from both harsh winds and unwelcome visitors. Adobe structures mixed with traditional wickiups, creating a settlement that bridged old ways with the practical demands of survival in an increasingly hostile world. Smoke drifted from cooking fires where Apache women prepared the morning meal, their voices carrying soft conversations in their native tongue. Children played between the dwellings, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls. Though Nashoba noticed how few of them practiced with small bows as he had in his youth, he paused beside the central fire pit where tribal elder Cocheta sat weaving baskets, her gnarled fingers moving with the precision that came from 7 decades of practice. Her eyes, clouded with age but sharp with wisdom, tracked his movement without looking up from her work. "You walk like a man carrying heavy thoughts, old friend," Cocheta said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying clearly in the still. Morning Air Nashoba lowered himself onto a smooth stone beside her, setting the war lance across his knees. The weight of it felt both comforting and burdensome. "I watch our young people, and I see them looking toward the white man's world instead of honoring what their ancestors built." "Change comes whether we invite it or not," Cocheta replied, selecting another reed for her basket. "The question is whether we guide that change or let it sweep us away like tumbleweeds in a storm." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. 3 Apache scouts rode into camp, their mounts lathered with sweat and their faces grim. Behind them, on a travois pulled by the lead horse, lay the still form of an old white man wrapped in blood-stained blankets. But what caught everyone's attention was the small figure walking beside the horses, a girl with sun-bleached braids and a face streaked with tears and desert dust. Nashoba stood as the procession entered the camp circle. The lead scout, a young warrior named Takala, dismounted and approached with obvious exhaustion etched in every line of his body. "We found them 2 days' ride north," Takala reported, his voice hoarse. The old man was defending a group of our women and children from renegade soldiers, white men wearing no uniforms, probably deserters looking for easy targets. "He fought beside our warriors until the end." Nashoba studied the girl, who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Despite her obvious grief and exhaustion, she stood straight-backed with a defiant tilt to her chin that spoke of inner strength. Her clothes were practical frontier wear, worn but well-made, and she carried herself with the careful alertness of someone who had learned early that the world could be dangerous. "The child?" Kocheta asked gently. "His granddaughter, Rose. She says her name is—" The old man, they called him Mountain Jack. He made sure she stayed hidden during the fighting. Kept saying she was all the family he had left. Takala's expression softened as he looked at the girl. "She hasn't spoken much, but what she has said shows respect for our ways." Mountain Jack taught her well. As word spread through the camp, other tribal members gathered. Nashoba watched their faces, reading the mix of emotions there. Sympathy for the orphan child warred with uncertainty about taking in a white outsider. These were dangerous times, and trust came hard. Rose seemed to sense the scrutiny. She stepped forward, her small hands clasped in front of her, and spoke in halting but recognizable Apache words. "I ask for nothing but a place to honor my grandfather's memory and perhaps learn from your wisdom." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The fact that she could speak any Apache at all was surprising, but more than that, her words showed understanding of proper protocols. This wasn't a frightened child begging for help. This was someone asking to be accepted into the community on its own terms. Kocheta rose from her seat with the careful movements of age, approaching Rose with gentle steps. She knelt before the girl, studying her face with eyes that had seen countless seasons of joy and sorrow. "Your grandfather was known to us," the elder said slowly. Mountain Jack traded fairly and spoke truth. "When the soldier boys came last, winter hunting our young men for crimes they didn't commit, he sent word to warn us. Good man, good friend." Rose's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her dust-stained cheeks. "He said the Apache were the most honorable people he'd ever known. He said if anything happened to him, I should find you and try to learn your ways." The crowd stirred again, but this time the mood felt different. Nashoba could see the shift happening from suspicion to consideration, from wariness to cautious acceptance. Still, he knew there would be challenges ahead. Taking in an orphaned white child was one thing. Truly integrating her into Apache life would be something else entirely. That evening, as the community gathered for the meal that would formally welcome Rose into their midst, Nashoba found himself studying the girl more carefully. She sat quietly beside Kocheta, observing everything with bright, intelligent eyes. When food was offered, she waited for the elders to eat, first another sign that Mountain Jack had indeed taught her proper respect. But there was something else about her, something in the way she watched the warriors cleaning their weapons and adjusting their bowstrings, that suggested interests beyond what most little girls displayed after the meal. As the adults settled into evening conversation and the younger children were sent to bed, Rose approached Nashoba with the same careful formality she had shown earlier. "Honored warrior," she began, her Apache still halting but her intention clear. "My grandfather told me stories of great Apache archers. He said their skill was like magic, that they could place an arrow exactly where they intended from distances that seemed impossible." Nashoba smiled despite himself. "Your grandfather spoke truth. The bow has been our companion for more generations than any man can count. It feeds us, protects us, and connects us to the spirits of our ancestors." Rose's eyes brightened with unmistakable interest. Would it be possible for someone like me to learn such skills? The question hung in the evening air like smoke from the dying fires. Around them, other conversations gradually quieted as people became aware of what the girl was asking. Nashoba felt the weight of many eyes upon him, waiting to see how he would respond to this unprecedented request. The war lance lay beside him, its familiar weight a reminder of all the traditions he was sworn to protect. Yet as he looked at this earnest child orphaned, displaced, but somehow unbroken, he found himself remembering Kocheta's words about guiding change, rather than being swept away by it. "Learning the bow is not a game for children," he said carefully. It requires dedication, discipline, and respect for powers that can bring both life and death. I understand, Rose replied immediately. My grandfather taught me that any skill worth having demands everything you can give it. Nashoba studied her face in the flickering firelight, seeing something there that reminded him of his own youth, that hunger to prove oneself worthy of ancient knowledge, that willingness to sacrifice comfort for the chance to touch something greater than yourself. We will speak of this again, he said finally. But first, you must learn our language properly, understand our customs, and show that you can be trusted with the responsibilities that come with such knowledge. Rose nodded solemnly, but Nashoba caught the flash of excitement in her eyes before she lowered her gaze respectfully. As the evening wound down and people began retiring to their dwellings, he remained by the fire, turning her request over in his mind. Cocheta settled beside him again, her basket weaving completed for the day. Interesting child, she observed. Indeed. Nashoba traced patterns in the dirt with the tip of his lance. But teaching our ways to an outsider, ... There will be those who object. There will be those who object to many things in the years ahead, Cocheta replied. The question is not whether she is Apache by blood, but whether she can become Apache by choice and dedication. Mountain Jack chose to stand with us when it mattered. Perhaps his granddaughter carries the same spirit. As the fire burned low, and the canyon settled into the deep quiet of desert night, Nashoba found himself wondering if this small, determined girl might represent something more than just another mouth to feed. In a time when so much was being lost, perhaps she could help them find new ways to preserve what mattered most. The war lance felt lighter in his hands as he finally rose to seek his rest. Though whether that lightness came from hope or uncertainty, he could not yet say. 3 weeks had passed since Rose's arrival, and the girl had thrown herself into learning Apache customs with the same intensity that marked everything she did. Her language skills improved daily, and she had begun helping the women with traditional tasks like gathering medicinal plants and preparing hides. But Nashoba noticed that her eyes still followed the warriors whenever they practiced with their weapons, and her questions about archery became more frequent and more specific. The moment of truth came during the weekly tribal council, when community decisions were made and grievances aired. The autumn air carried a crisp edge that spoke of winter's approach, and the gathered adults formed a circle around the central fire pit as shadows lengthened. Across the canyon floor, Rose had been quietly observing from the edge of the circle. As was appropriate for a child and newcomer, when tribal council leader Manolito called for new matters to be discussed. To everyone's surprise, Rose stood up with the formal bearing she had perfected over the past weeks. Honored elders and warriors, she began in carefully pronounced Apache. I request permission to address the council. A ripple of surprise moved through the gathering. Children were rarely heard in formal council, and never when they were outsiders who had been in the camp for mere weeks. But Manolito nodded for her to continue, perhaps out of curiosity about what this unusual child might say. Rose stepped forward into the firelight, her small frame dwarfed by the adult circle around her, but her voice carried clearly and without trembling. I wish to formally request instruction in the sacred art of the bow. The silence that followed was profound. Nashoba felt every eye in the council turn toward him, since everyone knew the girl had been asking him about archery since her arrival. He kept his expression neutral, though his mind raced through the implications of what Rose was proposing. Manolito spoke first, his voice carefully measured. Child, the bow is not a toy or a simple skill to be learned for amusement. It is a sacred trust passed down through bloodlines of our people. I understand this, honored leader, Rose replied, her formality never wavering. My grandfather taught me that all worthy knowledge comes with responsibility. I do not ask to play with your sacred traditions. I ask to serve them. Young warrior Bidzi laughed not cruelly, but with the easy dismissal of someone who couldn't take the request seriously. What does a little white girl know of service? Can you even draw a bowstring? Rose's jaw tightened slightly, but her respectful demeanor never cracked. I can learn whatever is required of me. My grandfather said the Apache judged by actions, not by appearances. Your grandfather was a good man, Elder Cocheda interjected gently, but he was not Apache. Some traditions are earned through generations of blood and sacrifice. Then let me earn them through my own blood and sacrifice, Rose responded immediately. Test me. Give me tasks to prove my worthiness. I did not choose to be born white, but I choose to honor the people who showed kindness to my grandfather and mercy to me. Nashoba finally spoke, his voice cutting through the growing murmur of conversation. The child asks for something that has never been granted to an outsider. Yet she asks in the proper way, showing respect for our customs and understanding of what she requests. That doesn't make her Apache, called out another warrior, Dakota, whose skepticism was well known. We cannot simply adopt every orphan who learns a few words of our language. Rose turned to face Dakota directly, and Nashoba was struck by the composure she maintained, despite being challenged by a grown warrior. I do not ask to be adopted as Apache by blood. I ask to be accepted as a student of Apache wisdom. There is a difference. The distinction was subtle but important, and Nashoba could see that several council members recognized it. Rather than claiming membership in the tribe, Rose was positioning herself as someone seeking to learn from them while acknowledging her outsider status. And what would you offer in return for such instruction? Manolito asked, his tone suggesting genuine consideration rather than dismissal. Rose had clearly anticipated this question. Whatever service is required. I can gather firewood, tend cooking fires, help with hunting preparations. I can learn to craft arrows and maintain weapons. My grandfather taught me to work hard and pay my debts. Pretty words, Dakota said, but the bow requires more than willingness to work. It requires strength, discipline, and a connection to the spirit world that outsiders cannot understand. Then teach me to understand, Rose replied simply. If I fail, the fault will be mine alone. If I succeed, perhaps it will prove that wisdom can cross bloodlines when it finds a worthy student. Nashoba watched the faces around the circle, reading the mix of emotions there. Some showed sympathy for the earnest child. Others displayed skepticism about breaking with tradition. A few seemed intrigued by the unprecedented nature of her request. Cocheda spoke again, her aged voice carrying special weight in council discussions. The girl shows proper respect and understanding of what she asks. Perhaps we should consider not whether she deserves the chance, but whether denying it would honor or dishonor the memory of Mountain Jack. This reframing of the question shifted the entire discussion. Mountain Jack's sacrifice in defense of Apache women and children was fresh in everyone's memory, and the debt of honor owed to him extended to his granddaughter. Manolito looked directly at Nashoba. You are our finest archer and most experienced. Teacher, if such instruction were to be given, it would fall to you. What is your counsel? Nashoba felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. Everything he said next would shape not only Rose's future, but potentially the tribe's relationship with tradition and change. He thought of his father's warlance, of the generations of knowledge passed down through Apache bloodlines, of the sacred nature of the skills Rose was requesting. But he also thought of the girl's unwavering respect, her obvious intelligence, and her grandfather's sacrifice. Most of all, he thought of Cocheda's words about guiding change rather than being swept away by it. I will make this offer, he said slowly, feeling the words shape themselves as he spoke. I will instruct the child in basic archery skills for 1 full moon cycle. If she shows proper dedication and natural ability, I will continue her training. If she proves unsuitable or disrespectful, the instruction ends with no shame to either party. Rose's face lit up with barely contained joy, but she maintained her formal posture. I accept these terms with gratitude and humility. The condition, Nashoba continued, raising his voice to address the entire council, is that she must prove herself not just to me but to all of you. At the end of her training, she will demonstrate her skills before the tribal council. Only then will we judge whether this experiment has honored or compromised our traditions. Manolito nodded slowly. These terms seem fair. Are there objections to this proposal? Dakota spoke up immediately. I object to the entire idea. Teaching our sacred skills to outsiders sets a dangerous precedent. Your objection is noted, Manolito replied. Are there others? 2 more warriors voiced similar concerns, but when the formal vote was called, the majority of the council agreed to allow Nashoba's proposed trial period. Rose would receive her chance to prove herself worthy of Apache archery instruction. As the council dispersed, Rose approached Nashoba with the same formal bearing she had maintained throughout the discussion. When do we begin, teacher? Tomorrow at dawn, Nashoba replied, studying her face in the dying firelight. Bring water. Wear clothes you can move freely in, and prepare yourself for more difficulty than you have ever experienced. I will be ready, Rose said simply. After she left to find her sleeping place, Toshida approached Nashoba with a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. You realize what you have committed yourself to? Teaching a stubborn child to shoot arrows, Nashoba replied. Though his tone suggested he understood, the implications went much deeper. Teaching a bridge between 2 worlds, Kocheda corrected. Gently. Whether that bridge stands or collapses will depend on both teacher and student. As Nashoba made his way to his own dwelling, he found himself already planning the next day's lessons. Rose had won her chance through courage and proper protocol, but now the real test would begin. He would craft a teaching bow specifically for her smaller-than-adult weapons, but functional, enough to determine whether her determination matched her words. The night air carried the scent of sage and wood smoke, familiar smells that spoke of home and continuity. But something had changed in the camp that evening, some subtle shift in the currents of possibility. Whether that change would strengthen or threaten the traditions Nashoba had sworn to protect remained to be seen. Tomorrow, he would begin teaching Apache archery to a white child, something that had never been done in the long history of his people. The precedent they were setting would echo far beyond this single girl's education, and Nashoba found himself hoping that wisdom, rather than folly, would guide them both in the days ahead. Dawn came cold and sharp across the canyon rim, painting the red rock walls in shades of gold and crimson. Rose was already waiting by the practice area when Nashoba arrived, her breath visible in small puffs of vapor and her eyes bright with anticipation. She had followed his instructions, precisely dressed in practical clothes that allowed free movement, with a water gourd slung across her shoulder and her hair braided back to keep it from interfering with her vision. Nashoba carried the teaching bow he had crafted through the night, working by firelight to create something that would serve Rose's smaller frame while maintaining the integrity of Apache design. The bow was shorter than those used by adult warriors, but carefully proportioned, made from seasoned oak and strung with sinew that had been properly prepared and tested. This bow would become the foundation of everything she learned. Before we begin, Nashoba said, setting the bow aside and gesturing for Rose to sit on a flat stone. You must understand that archery is not just about hitting targets. It is about connecting your spirit to the spirit of the weapon, the arrow, and the prey. Without this connection, you are merely throwing pointed sticks. Rose nodded solemnly, clearly prepared to absorb whatever wisdom he offered. My grandfather always said that any tool becomes part of the person using it. Your grandfather was wise. Nashoba picked up the bow, running his fingers along its smooth curves. This bow was made specifically for you. Feel its weight, learn its balance, understand how it wants to move in your hands. He handed the weapon to Rose, watching carefully as she examined it with the reverence appropriate for such a gift. Her small hands found the grip naturally, and she tested the draw weight with cautious pulls that showed respect for the bow's power. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Thank you for making this for me." "Beauty serves no purpose if it cannot perform," Nashoba replied, though he was pleased by her appreciation. "Now, we begin with stance. Everything else builds from how you position your body." The first lesson focused entirely on proper positioning, feet placement, shoulder alignment, and how to hold the bow without fighting its natural tendencies. Rose proved to be an attentive student, following instructions precisely and asking thoughtful questions about why each element mattered. "Your left shoulder is too high," Nashoba corrected gently, placing his hand on her shoulder to guide it into the proper position. "The bow should feel like a natural extension of your arm, not something you are wrestling with." Rose adjusted her stance, and Nashoba could see her trying to feel the difference his correction made. "Like this? Better. Now draw the string back, slowly using your back muscles rather than just your arm. Feel how the power should come from your whole body working together." The practice targets Nashoba had prepared were bundles of hay wrapped in hide, positioned at varying distances from the shooting line. Each target bore the marks of countless arrows from other training sessions, creating a record of lessons learned and skills developed. Rose would add her own marks to this collection, but first she needed to master the fundamentals that would make those marks meaningful rather than random. For the first week, Rose touched no arrows at all. Nashoba insisted she master the mechanics of drawing and aiming before introducing the complications of actually releasing projectiles. She practiced the motion hundreds of times each day, drawing the empty string back to her anchor point, holding steady, and releasing smoothly. Her dedication was absolute. When other children played games or helped with camp chores, Rose could be found in the practice area, repeating the motions Nashoba had taught her until they became as natural as breathing. Her hands developed calluses from the bowstring, and her arm muscles grew stronger from the repeated drawing motion. "She's at it again," Bidsy commented as he passed the practice area one afternoon, seeing Rose working through her exercises with single-minded focus. "Every day since she started," replied Takala, who had been watching Rose's progress with growing interest. "The girl doesn't seem to know when to quit." Nashoba overheard the conversation and felt a stirring of pride in his student. Dedication was the foundation of all martial skills, and Rose was displaying the kind of commitment that separated true archers from those who merely played with bows. When the week of dry practice ended, Nashoba finally allowed Rose to knock her first arrow. It was a simple target arrow with a blunt point, designed more for safety than accuracy. But Rose handled it with the same reverence she showed the bow itself. "Remember everything we have practiced," Nashoba instructed as Rose took her position. "At the shooting line, stance, draw, anchor, aim, release. Do not think about hitting the target. Think only about executing each step properly." Rose nodded, her face set in concentration. She knocked the arrow with careful precision, found her stance, and began the draw. Nashoba watched every movement, noting how she applied the lessons of the past week. Her form was not perfect, no beginners could be, but it showed clear understanding of the principles he had taught. The arrow flew straight and true, striking the target bundle with a solid dunk that echoed off the canyon walls. It was not a bullseye, but it was a clean hit that demonstrated proper technique. "Good," Nashoba said simply, though internally he was impressed by how quickly Rose had translated theory into practice. Again, the second arrow struck even closer to center, and the third closer still. By the end of that first session with live arrows, Rose was consistently hitting the target bundle from 20 paces. A respectable performance for someone who had been shooting for less than an hour. Word of Rose's rapid progress began to spread through the camp. Apache children who had grown up around bows and arrows, found themselves curious about how quickly the white girl was learning skills that some of them had struggled with for years. A few began appearing at the practice area during Rose's training sessions, ostensibly to watch, but clearly comparing their own abilities to hers. "She makes it look easy," observed Chaska, a boy of 12 who had been practicing archery for 2 years without achieving Rose's level of consistency. "It's not easy," Rose replied, overhearing the comment as she retrieved her arrows from the target, "but it's worth the work." The comment revealed something important about Rose's approach that impressed Nashoba. She didn't boast about her rapid improvement or act as though her success came without effort. Instead, she acknowledged the difficulty while emphasizing the value of perseverance. As the second week progressed, Nashoba began introducing more complex elements, shooting from different distances, adjusting for wind, and accounting for the arc of the arrow's flight. Rose absorbed each new lesson with the same intensity she had shown from the beginning, practicing each technique until it became automatic. Her improvement was undeniable, but Nashoba was equally pleased by her attitude. She showed proper respect for the weapons, helped maintain the practice area, and never complained about the physical demands of training. When other children tried to distract her with games or conversation, she politely declined and returned to her practice. "The girl has the spirit of a warrior," Kocheta observed one evening as she and Nashoba watched Rose cleaning her arrows by firelight. "She has discipline," Nashoba agreed. "But discipline alone does not make an archer. We will see how she responds when the challenges become greater." Those greater challenges were already being planned. Nashoba knew that Rose's rapid progress in controlled conditions was impressive, but real archery skill required adaptation to changing circumstances, pressure situations, and the unpredictable demands of actual hunting or combat. The next phase of her training would test whether her natural ability could withstand more demanding conditions. But for now, he was content to watch his student master the fundamentals with a dedication that reminded him of his own youth. The target bundles showed clear evidence of her daily practice tight, groupings of arrow holes that spoke of improving consistency and growing confidence. The teaching bow had become an extension of Rose's will, and the practice targets bore witness to her determination. Whether that determination would be enough for the challenges ahead remained to be seen, but Nashoba found himself increasingly optimistic about this unusual student who had changed his understanding of what was possible. The morning of Rose's third week of training brought an unexpected challenge. A group of Apache boys, ranging in age from 10 to 15, had gathered at the practice area before dawn, clearly intending to test a white girl who had been drawing so much attention with her archery skills. Chaska stood at the center of the group, holding his own bow with the confidence of someone who had been using it for years. "We want to see if this outsider is really as good as people say," he announced as Rose arrived for her morning session. Rose studied the group calmly, showing no sign of intimidation despite being outnumbered and outmatched in experience. "I'm here to practice, not to compete," she replied diplomatically. "Afraid you'll lose?" taunted Niall, a boy of 13 whose family had been particularly vocal about their objections to teaching Apache skills to an outsider. Nashoba arrived at that moment, taking in the situation with a quick glance. He could see the challenge in the boy's postures and the quiet determination in Rose's stance. This confrontation had been inevitable, and perhaps it was better to address it directly rather than let tensions fester. "If you wish to compete," Nashoba said calmly, "then let it be a proper competition with clear rules and fair judging." He gestured toward the target bundles, which had been set at varying distances to accommodate different skill levels. "Each archer will shoot 3 arrows at each distance, starting from 20 paces and moving back to 40 paces. Accuracy and consistency will determine the winner." Rose looked uncertain for the first time since beginning her training. Teacher, I have only been shooting for 2 weeks, and they have been shooting for years, Nashoba interrupted gently. But skill is not measured by time alone. If you choose to accept this challenge, I will support your decision. If you choose to continue with your regular practice, that is also acceptable. The boys exchanged glances, clearly expecting Rose to back down from a contest where she would be at such an obvious disadvantage. But Rose straightened her shoulders and picked up her teaching bow with steady hands. I accept the challenge, she said simply. What followed was a revelation that surprised everyone, including Nashoba. Rose's arrows flew with a consistency that spoke of natural talent refined by intensive practice. While the older boys had more raw power and could draw heavier bows, Rose's technique was cleaner, her focus more complete, and her shots more predictable. At 20 paces, she matched the best of the boys arrow for arrow. At 30 paces, she began to pull ahead as some of the competitors struggled with the increased distance. By the time they reached 40 paces, Rose was clearly the most accurate archer in the group, her arrows grouping tightly around the center of the target, while the boys' shots scattered more widely. The silence that followed the final round was profound. Chaska stared at the target bundles, counting arrow holes and realizing that the white girl he had intended to humiliate had just outshot every Apache boy in the group. How is this possible? Niall demanded, his voice carrying more confusion than anger. You've been shooting for 2 weeks. I've been practicing for 3 years. Rose retrieved her arrows carefully, showing the same respect for her equipment that had marked all her training. My teacher is very good, she said simply, and I practice more than I do anything else. Nashoba watched the interactions that followed with deep interest. Rather than gloating over her victory, Rose offered to help the boys with their technique, pointing out small adjustments that might improve their accuracy. Most surprisingly, several of them accepted her suggestions with genuine curiosity rather than wounded pride. Your stance is a little wide, Rose told Chaska as he prepared for another shot. Try bringing your feet closer together and see if that helps your balance. The adjustment worked, and Chaska's next arrow struck closer to center than any of his previous attempts. His expression shifted from skepticism to grudging respect as he looked at Rose with new eyes. Where did you learn to see things like that? He asked. My teacher showed me how every part of the body affects the shot, Rose replied. When you understand how it all connects, you can see what might be causing problems. As word of the competition spread through the camp, Rose found herself receiving a different kind of attention. The Apache women, who had already begun accepting her presence, now started approaching her directly, asking about her training and offering their own forms of instruction. Iha, a woman known for her skill in crafting leather goods, approached Rose after the archery contest with a carefully made arm guard decorated with intricate beadwork. For your protection while shooting, she explained, helping Rose fit the guard to her left forearm. A warrior must care for her equipment, but equipment must also care for the warrior. Rose examined the beaded patterns with obvious appreciation, recognizing the time and skill that had gone into creating such a beautiful piece. The geometric designs incorporated traditional Apache symbols for strength, accuracy, and protection, a clear sign that the women of the tribe were beginning to see her as more than just a temporary visitor. This is beautiful, Rose said, running her fingers over the smooth beadwork. Thank you for thinking I deserve such a gift. You earn what you receive, Iha replied simply. Your respect for our ways and your dedication to learning properly shows you understand the value of what you're being taught. The arm guard became Rose's most treasured possession, and she wore it during every practice session. More than mere protection, it served as a visible symbol of her growing acceptance within the Apache community. The other archers noticed it immediately, recognizing both its quality and its significance. Nashoba began incorporating new elements into Rose's training. building on her demonstrated aptitude for the fundamental skills. She learned to judge wind direction and strength, to compensate for different arrow weights, and to shoot accurately from unconventional positions. Hunting is not done from a comfortable practice line, Nashoba explained as he had Rose attempt shots while kneeling, crouching, and even lying prone. You must be able to deliver accurate shots, regardless of circumstances. Rose approached these challenges with the same methodical dedication she had shown from the beginning. When a particular position felt awkward or unstable, she practiced it repeatedly until it became comfortable. When wind conditions made aiming difficult, she studied the way grass and leaves moved to better understand air currents. Her improvement continued at a pace that impressed even Nashoba, who had seen many students over the years. But more important than her technical progress was the way she was integrating into the broader life of the Apache community. She helped with hunting preparations, learned to craft arrows with the proper balance and fletching, and began participating in the daily routines that bound the tribe together. When hunting parties returned with game, Rose was among the first to help with processing the meat and preparing hides. She learned which parts were used for different purposes, how to preserve meat for winter storage, and the proper prayers of gratitude that honored the animals who gave their lives to sustain the people. Root arrows require good materials, explained Koda, an old warrior who specialized in arrow making. But good materials require understanding of the animals they come from. Rose absorbed these lessons with the same intensity she brought to archery practice. She learned to select the straightest shafts, to prepare sinew for binding, and to choose feathers that would provide the best guidance for each arrow's flight. Her arrows began to rival those made by experienced craftsmen, another sign of her growing competence in Apache skills. The beaded arm guard became a conversation starter as tribal members noticed the quality of Iha's work and the significance of presenting such a gift to an outsider. Rather than creating resentment, it seemed to open more doors for Rose, as other skilled women began offering their own forms of instruction. "Would you like to learn proper care for weapons?" asked Idzel, a woman whose husband was known as one of the finest bowmakers in the region. A warrior who cannot maintain her tools will find them failing when they are needed most. Rose eagerly accepted every opportunity to learn, understanding that each skill built upon the others to create comprehensive knowledge. She learned to check bowstrings for wear, to identify the subtle signs that indicated an arrow was no longer true, and to make field repairs that could save a hunt or a life. As her 4th week of training began, Nashoba decided it was time to test Rose's skills in a more practical setting. Rather than continuing with target practice alone, he would take her on an actual hunting expedition to see how her abilities translated to real-world conditions. "Tomorrow we hunt," he announced after her morning practice session. "Prepare yourself for a different kind of test." Rose nodded seriously, understanding that this represented a significant step forward in her education. "What should I bring?" "Your bow, a full quiver of arrows, water, and the patience to spend hours waiting for the right moment," Nashoba replied. "Most importantly, bring the humility to understand that hunting is about feeding the people, not proving your skill." That evening, Rose carefully inspected her equipment and prepared for the hunt with the thoroughness that had become her trademark. The beaded arm guard was cleaned and adjusted, her bowstring checked for proper tension, and each arrow examined for straightness and proper fletching. She fell asleep that night with a mixture of excitement and nervousness, knowing that tomorrow would show whether all her practice had prepared her for the real purpose of Apache archery, providing food for the community that had accepted her as one of their own. The target bundles in the practice area bore the marks of her dedicated training, silent witnesses to the transformation of a grieving orphan into a skilled archer, whose shots could rival those of warriors with years more experience. Tomorrow would tell whether that skill could serve its true purpose, In the wild places where Apache hunters had tested themselves for countless generations, the autumn morning mist clung to the canyon floor as Rose followed Nashoba through trails that seemed invisible to her untrained eye. They moved in the silence that all successful hunters cultivated, communicating through hand signals and shared understanding rather than words that might alert potential prey. Rose carried her teaching bow and a quiver of hunting arrows, pointed projectiles designed to kill cleanly rather than the blunt practice arrows she had been using. The weight of responsibility sat heavily on her shoulders. This was no longer about hitting targets or impressing fellow students. Today, her arrows might mean the difference between the tribe eating well or going hungry. Nashoba led them to a game trail that showed fresh deer sign, pointing out the subtle indicators that Rose was only beginning to learn to read. Hoof prints in soft earth, broken twigs at deer height, and the scattered droppings that told experienced hunters how recently animals had passed through. Patience is the hunter's greatest weapon, Nashoba whispered as they settled into position, downwind from the trail. Many young hunters fail because they cannot wait for the right moment. They waited and waited. Rose fought the urge to fidget or adjust her position, understanding that movement could spoil hours of careful preparation. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist and revealing the stark beauty of the desert landscape around them. When the deer finally appeared, Rose almost missed them. One moment the trail seemed empty, and the next the doe was stepping delicately through the brush, followed by a smaller yearling. Nashoba's hand touched Rose's shoulder, a signal to prepare, but not yet shoot. Rose knocked an arrow with movements so slow they were barely perceptible, drawing on all the patience and discipline her training had instilled. The doe was alert, head raised and ears swiveling to catch any sound that might indicate danger. Nashoba's whispered breath in her ear was so quiet it might have been the wind. Clean shot through the chest. Wait for her to turn broadside. Rose drew her bow with infinite care, feeling the familiar tension of the string and the balance of the arrow against the rest. The doe turned, presenting the perfect angle, and Rose found her anchor point as naturally as breathing. The arrow flew true, striking exactly where Nashoba had indicated. The deer leaped once and collapsed, while the yearling bounded away into the brush with the characteristic white flash of tail that gave their kind one of their Apache names. "Well done," Nashoba said simply, but Rose could hear genuine approval in his voice. "Clean kill. Proper placement." The animal did not suffer. As they approached the fallen deer, Nashoba began teaching Rose the ceremonies that surrounded successful hunts. Prayers of gratitude to the animal spirit, recognition of the life given to sustain life, and the proper way to begin field preparation of the meat. "Every part will be used," Nashoba explained as he demonstrated the initial cuts that would allow them to transport the deer back to camp. Hide for clothing and tools, sinew for bowstrings, bones for arrow points and needles. Nothing is wasted when life gives itself for life. Rose helped with the work, learning techniques that were both practical skills and sacred rituals. Her hands became bloody as she learned to separate meat from bone, but she never flinched from the necessary tasks. This was the reality behind all her target practice, the serious business of survival that has sustained her adopted people for countless generations. When they returned to camp with the deer, the reaction exceeded Rose's expectations. News of her successful hunt spread quickly, and tribal members who had remained skeptical about teaching outsider Apache skills found their objections harder to maintain. A 10-year-old girl had just proven she could contribute meaningfully to the community's survival. Cocheta examined the deer with expert eyes, noting the placement of Rose's arrow and the clean nature of the kill. "Good shooting," she pronounced, which from the respected elder carried the weight of official approval. But the real test of Rose's growing skills came 3 days later, when runners brought word that the annual tribal games were being moved up by several weeks. Normally held in late autumn, The games would now take place in just over a month, gathering Apache bands from across the region for competitions that celebrated traditional skills and strengthened bonds between communities. Manolito called a special council meeting to discuss the news and its implications. Rose sat with the other young people at the edge of the circle, listening as the adults debated how to prepare for the accelerated timeline. "The games are not just competition," explained Elder Dakota, his earlier skepticism about Rose's training momentarily set aside in favor of practical concerns. "They strengthen our connections with other bands and demonstrate to the younger generation that our traditions remain vital." As discussion continued, Rose became aware that many eyes were turning toward her. The success of her hunt had been notable, but hunting accuracy was only one component of the skills tested during the games. Archery competition at the tribal level demanded precision, power, and consistency under pressure that far exceeded anything she had yet experienced. "The question," Manolito said finally, "is whether our newest archers should be considered for inclusion in the competitions." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Including Rose in the games would make a powerful statement about the tribe's willingness to embrace change and recognize merit regardless of bloodlines. Excluding her after her obvious progress and successful hunt might seem like a betrayal of the principles they claimed to uphold. Nashoba spoke carefully, weighing each word. "The girl has shown remarkable aptitude and proper respect for our traditions. But the games test skills she has not yet learned and present pressures she has not yet faced. What would be required for her to compete?" asked Cocheda her question, showing that she was seriously considering the possibility. "Intensive preparation," Nashoba replied. "Training in techniques beyond basic archery, practice under competitive conditions, and demonstration that she can perform consistently when others are watching and judging." Rose found herself holding her breath as the discussion continued around her. The idea of competing in the tribal games was both thrilling and terrifying. She had worked so hard to prove herself worthy of Apache instruction, but this would test whether that instruction had produced a truly skilled archer or merely an enthusiastic student. When Manolito finally called for her to speak, Rose stood with the same formal bearing she had shown during her original request for training. "Honored elders, I am grateful for any opportunity to serve this community. If my participation in the games would bring honor to the tribe, I will train as hard as necessary to be worthy of that honor. If my participation would be seen as inappropriate or divisive, I will continue my education without complaint." The diplomatic response pleased several council members, but Nashoba knew that Rose's true feelings were more complex than her carefully neutral words suggested. He could see the hunger in her eyes, the same drive that had pushed her to master basic archery so quickly now focused on this greater challenge. That night, as the council debated late into the evening, Nashoba found himself examining a set of ancient record stones that documented remarkable achievements from tribal games of the past. The carved symbols told stories of legendary archers whose skills had become the stuff of Apache folklore, men and women whose arrows had flown farther and straighter than any before or since. One stone in particular caught his attention, commemorating an archer who had achieved what was considered impossible, hitting targets at distances that seemed to exceed the physical capabilities of traditional bows. The record had stood for over 50 years. Unchallenged by generations of skilled competitors. As he traced the carved symbols with his finger, Nashoba wondered whether Rose's unusual combination of natural talent and intensive training might be capable of achieving something truly extraordinary. Her progress had already exceeded his most optimistic expectations. Perhaps it was time to see how far that progress could take her when faced with the ultimate test of Apache archery skills. The record stones held their silent testimony to past greatness, waiting to see whether a new generation might add their own achievements to the ancient chronicles of Apache excellence. The tribal council's decision came at dawn, delivered by Manolito himself as Rose prepared for her morning practice. She would be allowed to compete in the archery portion of the tribal games, but with conditions that reflected both opportunity and responsibility. "You will train under the most intensive schedule we can devise," Manolito explained, his weathered face serious in the early light. "Nashoba will prepare you not just in technique, but in the mental discipline required to perform when all eyes are upon you. Failure will be seen as a reflection on our judgment in accepting an outsider into our sacred traditions." Rose nodded gravely, understanding the weight of expectation that now rested on her young shoulders. "I will not dishonor the faith you have shown in me." What followed was a transformation in Rose's training that pushed her beyond anything she had previously experienced. Nashoba restructured her entire daily routine around archery preparation, incorporating elements that tested not just her shooting accuracy, but her ability to maintain focus under stress. "Competition archery is different from hunting," Nashoba explained as he set up a series of challenging scenarios. "In hunting, you wait for the perfect moment. In competition, you must create the perfect moment on demand." He began requiring Rose to shoot while tribal members watched and commented, simulating the pressure she would face during the actual games. Some observers were encouraging, but others deliberately tried to distract her with conversation or criticism, testing her ability to maintain concentration despite external interference. Rose struggled initially with the added pressure, her shots becoming less consistent when she knew people were evaluating every arrow. But gradually, she learned to create a mental space around herself, focusing so completely on the technical aspects of shooting that outside distractions faded into background noise. The training intensified further when visiting Apache spiritual leader, Ayana, arrived to conduct a ceremony that would formally recognize Rose's progress from student to competitor. The ritual involved purification ceremonies, prayers for guidance, and the presentation of sacred feathers earned through demonstrated courage and skill. These feathers carry the spirits of eagles who soared highest and saw farthest, Ayana explained as she attached the specially prepared feathers to Rose's arrows. "They will guide your shots true if your heart remains pure and your intentions honor the traditions you represent." The sacred feathers transformed Rose's arrows from mere practice equipment into spiritual tools, each one blessed with ceremonies that connected her shooting to the larger Apache understanding of harmony between hunter, weapon, and prey. The weight of this spiritual dimension added another layer to her preparation, as she learned prayers and meditations that were traditionally reserved for experienced warriors. Rose's dedication to this enhanced training schedule bordered on obsession. She rose before dawn to practice in the cool morning air, spent midday hours learning the mental disciplines that Ayana taught, and ended each day with physical conditioning designed to build the strength and endurance needed for sustained accurate shooting. The improvement in her skills was dramatic and undeniable. Shots that had once challenged her became routine, and she began attempting techniques that even some experienced archers found difficult. Her arrows flew with a consistency that impressed the most skeptical observers, and her range extended far beyond what anyone had expected from someone so young and new to the sport. But the most significant change was in her identity within the tribal community. The Apache women who had initially been cautious about accepting an outsider now treated Rose as one of their own daughters, offering advice about everything from proper diet for maintaining shooting, strength to techniques for managing the anxiety that could sabotage performance under pressure. "Breathe like the wind through the canyon," advised Idzel, the wife of the master bowmaker. "Steady, strong, but never forced. Your breathing must carry your arrow to its target, as surely as the wind carries an eagle's flight." Rose absorbed these teachings with the same intensity she brought to technical instruction, understanding that the mental and spiritual aspects of archery were just as important as physical technique. She learned to enter a meditative state before each shot, connecting her intention to the larger rhythms of nature that govern all successful hunting and competition. The romantic subplot that had been developing quietly in the background became more prominent as young warrior Dakota began paying increased attention to Rose's remarkable progress. His interest was genuine rather than merely competitive, and he offered his own insights based on years of tribal game participation. "The key is not to think about winning," Dakota told Rose as they walked together after one of her training sessions. "Think only about shooting perfectly. If you shoot perfectly, the results take care of themselves." Rose appreciated his advice and found herself looking forward to their conversations, though she remained focused primarily on her preparation for the games. The growing attraction between them added another dimension to her integration into Apache life, suggesting possibilities for a future that extended far beyond the immediate challenge of competition. As the weeks passed and the games drew closer, Rose faced new pressures that tested her resolve. Some members of visiting Apache bands questioned whether an outsider should be allowed to compete in sacred traditional contests, arguing that her participation violated ancient customs and set dangerous precedents. "What's next?" demanded a visiting warrior named Kurik during a tense community meeting. "Will we invite cavalry soldiers to participate in our sacred dances? Will we teach our most guarded secrets to anyone who asks politely?" Rose listened to these objections without defending herself, understanding that the decision about her participation was ultimately not hers to make. But Nashoba spoke forcefully in her defense, citing her demonstrated respect for Apache ways and her legitimate right to compete based on merit rather than bloodlines. "This child has proven herself through dedication and achievement," Nashoba declared, his voice carrying the authority of his reputation as the tribe's finest archer. "She has honored our traditions by mastering them completely, not by claiming them without earning the right to do so." The debate revealed deep divisions within the Apache community about how to balance preservation of tradition with adaptation to changing circumstances. Rose found herself at the center of these larger questions, representing not just her own aspirations, but the tribe's collective decision about what it meant to be Apache in a rapidly changing world. Despite the controversy, her training continued at its intensive pace. Nashoba began introducing the most advanced techniques in his repertoire, skills that were traditionally passed down only to the most promising young warriors. Rose learned to adjust for wind conditions that would confuse less experienced archers, to compensate for different arrow weights and bow tensions, and to maintain accuracy even when shooting from awkward positions or unusual distances. The sacred feathers on her arrows had become symbols of her unique position within the tribal community, an outsider who had earned insider knowledge through dedication and respect, representing both continuity and change in Apache traditions. Whether those feathers would guide her arrows true during the pressure of actual competition remained to be seen, but her preparation had been as thorough as any competitor in the history of the tribal games. The discovery came 3 days before the tribal games were scheduled to begin. Hidden in a bundle of her grandfather's possessions that Rose had barely touched since arriving at the Apache camp, she had been preparing her gear for the competition when she noticed a leather pouch sewn into the lining of Mountain Jack's old travel pack, a hiding place she had never known existed. Inside the pouch was a letter written in her grandfather's careful script, along with a small carved pendant bearing symbols she had learned to recognize as Apache clan markings. Rose's hands trembled as she unfolded the letter, uncertain what secrets it might contain. "My dear Rose," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then the Lord has called me home, and you have found your way to the people I told you about. There are things I should have told you long ago, but the pain of old memories kept me silent. You have more right to be among the Apache than you know." Rose's heart raced as she continued reading, each sentence revealing truths that recontextualized everything she thought she knew about her own identity. Your great-grandmother was named Morning Star, and she was born Apache. She was taken from her people when soldiers raided her village in 1847, sold to a family in Santa Fe who wanted a servant girl who could speak both Apache and Spanish. She was barely 14 years old. The letter went on to describe Morning Star's forced assimilation into white society, her eventual marriage to Rose's great-grandfather, and the family's decision to hide their Apache heritage to protect their children from the prejudice and violence that often targeted anyone with Indian blood. Morning Star never forgot her people or their ways. She taught me some of the language in secret, told me stories about Apache customs, and made me promise that if anything ever happened to our family, I would find her tribe and tell them she never stopped being Apache in her heart. Rose sank onto her sleeping furs, overwhelmed by the implications of what she was learning. The natural ability with the bow that had surprised everyone suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't just talent, but inherited knowledge passed down through bloodlines she had never known existed. The pendant belonged to Morning Star's clan. The letter continued. Show it to the tribal elders, and they will know you come by your Apache heritage honestly. You are not just learning their ways, child. You are reclaiming them. Rose examined the pendant more closely, recognizing symbols that she had seen on ceremonial objects and traditional clothing. If her grandfather's story was true, then her entire status within the tribe would change from grateful outsider to returning family member. She sat in stunned silence for a long time, trying to process the magnitude of this revelation. Every challenge she had faced, every skeptical comment about teaching sacred skills to an outsider, every moment of doubt about whether she truly belonged among the Apache, all of it took on new meaning in light of her actual heritage. When she finally emerged from her dwelling, she carried the letter and pendant directly to Cocheta, understanding that such news needed to be shared with the tribal elders before anyone else. The old woman examined both items carefully, her experienced eyes reading the symbols and evaluating the authenticity of the carved pendant. This is genuine, Cocheta said finally, her voice carrying the weight of certain knowledge. These clan markings are from the Eastern bands, and the carving style is from the right time period. If your grandfather spoke truth, then you carry the blood of my own sister's line. The news spread through the camp with the speed of wildfire, fundamentally altering how tribal members viewed Rose's remarkable progress with Apache skills. What had seemed like unprecedented natural talent was revealed as ancestral knowledge awakening, the return of abilities that had never truly been lost. Nashoba's reaction was particularly profound. As he examined the pendant and listened to Cocheta's explanation of its significance, his understanding of his relationship with Rose shifted dramatically. He had known Morning Star as a child, before the raid that took her from the tribe. She had been his playmate and, in the innocent way of childhood, his first love. Your great-grandmother was my childhood friend, he told Rose, his voice thick with emotion. We played together, learned together, and I mourned her loss for years after she was taken. Teaching you has felt like welcoming her home. The revelation transformed the dynamics surrounding Rose's participation in the tribal games. Opponents who had argued against allowing an outsider to compete found their primary objection eliminated. Rose wasn't an outsider being granted special privileges. She was a returning family member reclaiming her birthright. But the new knowledge also brought new pressures. Rather than simply proving that a motivated outsider could master Apache skills, Rose now carried the weight of ancestral expectations. She was representing not just herself and her adopted tribe, but the memory of a great-grandmother who had been forced to abandon her people and traditions. Morning Star was known for her skill with the bow. Cocheta revealed during a special ceremony to formally recognize Rose's heritage. The women of her line were always strong archers, Your talent comes not just from good teaching, but from blood that remembers what it once knew. The ceremony itself was deeply moving, involving prayers that welcomed Rose home and rituals that connected her formally to the clan lineage she had unknowingly carried all her life. Tribal members who had remained skeptical about her rapid progress now spoke with wonder about the mysterious ways that ancestors could guide their descendants back to where they belonged. Takota's interest in Rose took on new significance as, well, what had begun as attraction to an unusual outsider had become courtship of a legitimate clan member with proper standing in the community. Their relationship could now develop without the complications that might have surrounded romance between an Apache warrior and a white immigrant. But perhaps the most profound change was in Rose's own understanding of her identity. The questions she had carried about whether she truly belonged among the Apache were answered definitively. She wasn't choosing to become something foreign to her nature. She was choosing to reclaim something that had always been part of who she was. As she prepared for the tribal games with this new knowledge weighing on her mind, Rose found herself approaching the competition with different motivations. Success would no longer just prove her individual worth or vindicate the tribe's decision to train her. Success would honor the memory of Morning Star and demonstrate that Apache heritage could survive even decades of forced separation from tribal life. The hidden family letter that had revealed these truths became a treasured artifact, proof of connections that transcended the attempts of an hostile world to sever them. Rose carried it with her as she completed her final preparations for the games, a tangible reminder that her arrows would carry not just her own hopes, but the dreams of ancestors who had never stopped believing in the possibility of return. Revelation reframed everything that had come before and everything that was yet to come, transforming Rose's story from one of adoption into one of homecoming, and her potential success from impressive achievement into family destiny finally fulfilled. The morning of the tribal games dawned clear and cold, with a crisp wind that would challenge even the most experienced archers. Apache bands from across the region had gathered in the ceremonial valley, their colorful camps creating a temporary city that buzzed with excitement and friendly rivalry. Rose stood at the edge of her own camp, watching the sunrise paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and crimson, while trying to calm the nervous energy that had kept her awake most of the night. Nashoba approached carrying the competition bow he had crafted specifically for this day. It was a masterwork of traditional Apache bowmaking, created from the finest materials and blessed through ceremonies that connected it to the spiritual realm. Unlike her teaching bow, this weapon had been designed to channel every bit of Rose's strength and skill into achieving maximum accuracy and distance. "This bow carries the prayers of our entire tribe," Nashoba said, as he presented it to her with formal ceremony. "It is not just a tool, but a partner that will help you honor your ancestors and demonstrate the truths they taught us about what is possible when spirit and skill unite." Rose accepted the bow with hands that trembled slightly, feeling the perfect balance and responsiveness that marked Nashoba's finest work. The weapon seemed to vibrate with potential energy, eager to prove itself in the competitions ahead. Every detail spoke of master craftsmanship, from the precisely curved limbs that would store and release maximum power, to the grip wrapped in leather that had been prepared with traditional methods to provide the perfect connection between archer and bowdot. As the morning progressed, competitors from various bands gathered for the opening ceremonies that would formally begin the games. Rose found herself studying her potential rivals with the analytical eye that Nashoba had taught her to cultivate. There was a Hote from the Western bands, whose reputation for long-distance accuracy was legendary. Nalnish from the Northern Territory, who was said to be able to hit moving targets that other archers couldn't even see clearly. And most intimidating of all, Tahoma, the defending champion whose technique was so flawless that other archers traveled great distances just to watch him compete. Each of them brings different strengths, Nashoba observed quietly as they watched the other competitors warm up. But none of them brings your combination of natural ability and intensive preparation. Trust in your training and remember that arrows fly true when the archer's mind is clear and focused. The early competitions would test various aspects of archery skill: accuracy at set distances, shooting under time pressure, and the ability to adjust for changing wind conditions. Rose had practiced all these scenarios extensively, but the pressure of formal competition created an entirely different atmosphere than anything she had previously experienced. Her first event was distance accuracy, where archers had to hit targets placed at progressively greater ranges. Rose's group included 8 competitors, each taking 3 shots at each distance before moving to the next range. The scoring was based on both accuracy and consistency, rewarding archers who could maintain their technique regardless of the challenges involved. The first round at 30 paces felt almost routine after months of intensive practice. Rose's arrows grouped tightly around the center of the target, matching the performance of the more experienced competitors and establishing her credibility as a serious contender. The gathered crowd began paying closer attention to the young archer, who was holding her own against seasoned veterans at 40 paces. The competition became more challenging as wind conditions picked up, and the smaller target demanded greater precision. Rose drew on all the mental discipline that Ayana had taught her, entering the meditative state that blocked out distractions and focused her entire being on the single objective of placing each arrow exactly where she intended. Her first arrow struck the center ring. Her second landed barely an inch away. Her third split the wooden shaft of her first arrow, a feat that drew appreciative murmurs from the watching crowd and grudging nods of respect from her fellow competitors. "That girl shoots like she was born to it," commented one of the elder judges, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. By the time they reached 50 paces, only 5 archers remained in serious contention. The target had been reduced in size to increase the challenge, and the wind had become gusty enough to require constant adjustment of aim. Rose found herself drawing on techniques that Nashoba had taught her only weeks before, reading the subtle signs that indicated how air currents would affect her arrow's flight. Tahoma, the defending champion, shot first in their group, placing all 3 arrows within the scoring rings, but missing the center that would have guaranteed maximum points. Ahote followed with similarly solid, but not spectacular results. When Rose's turn came, the crowd had grown noticeably larger as word spread about the young archer's impressive performance. Rose knocked her first arrow and entered the focused state that had become second nature through months of practice. The wind died for a moment, creating perfect conditions, and her arrow flew straight to the center of the target. The second shot faced a slight crosswind that she compensated for instinctively, placing the arrow within inches of her first. For her final shot, she faced the most challenging conditions, yet a gusting wind that would test every aspect of her training. She waited and waited. Patience had been one of Nashoba's earliest lessons, and Rose had learned to trust her instincts about when conditions were right for a perfect shot. When the wind finally stilled, she released her arrow with absolute confidence. The arrow struck dead center, splitting her first arrow in a display of precision that stunned even the most experienced observers. The crowd erupted in appreciative cheers, and Rose found herself the center of attention as word of her performance spread throughout the gathering. "I've never seen shooting like that from someone so young," declared Manolito, his voice carrying the pride of someone whose judgment in allowing Rose to compete had been thoroughly vindicated. But Rose knew that the morning's events were merely preliminary competitions designed to determine seeding for the afternoon's main events. The real tests lay ahead, in contests that would push her skills to their absolute limits and determine whether her months of preparation had truly prepared her for the highest levels of Apache archery competition. As the lunch break began, Tribal members approached Rose with congratulations and words of encouragement, but she found herself increasingly focused on what lay ahead rather than celebrating what she had already achieved. The competition bow felt perfect in her hands, and the sacred feathers on her arrows seemed to whisper promises of continued accuracy. But she understood that the afternoon would present challenges unlike anything she had faced before. Nashoba joined her for a quiet meal away from the crowds, using the time to review strategy for the final competitions and remind her of the mental techniques that would be crucial for maintaining focus under increased pressure. "The hardest part is behind you now," he said, though they both knew this wasn't entirely true. "You have proven you belong here. Now you must prove what your ancestors always knew, that Apache blood runs true regardless of where it has wandered." Rose nodded, understanding that the afternoon would test not just her individual skills, but her ability to honor the legacy of Morning Star and all the Apache women who had passed down the knowledge that flowed through her veins. The competition bow rested beside her, ready to channel that ancestral wisdom into arrows that would fly straight and true toward targets that represented more than mere scoring rings. The ancient record stones lay, waiting in the ceremonial area, their carved symbols chronicling achievements that had seemed impossible until they were accomplished. Whether Rose would add her own mark to those chronicles depended on her ability to unite all her training, all her heritage, and all her determination into performances that would echo through Apache memory for generations to come. The afternoon sun hung high in the desert sky as competitors gathered for the final archery challenge, the legendary distance contest that had produced the most celebrated records in Apache tribal history. The target was smaller than anything used in previous events, positioned at a range that pushed traditional bows to their absolute limits. Only the morning's top 5 archers had qualified for this ultimate test, and the crowd had swelled to include virtually every member of the gathered tribes. Rose stood in line with Tahoma, Ahotanalnish, and Kurik, the visiting warrior whose objections to her participation had been the most vocal. Each archer would shoot 3 arrows, with scoring based on a combination of accuracy and distance that rewarded both precision and power. The current record, carved into the ancient stones 53 years earlier, seemed almost mythical in its requirements. Tahoma stepped forward first, his reputation earning him the honor of opening the competition. The defending champion drew his powerful bow with fluid motion, his technique flawless as always. His first arrow arced high through the desert air, fighting wind and gravity to reach the distant target. It struck within the scoring rings, but missed the center by several inches, a respectable shot that established the baseline all other competitors would need to exceed. His second arrow flew truer, finding the inner rings and drawing appreciative murmurs from the crowd. But his third shot, affected by a sudden gust of wind, sailed wide of the target entirely. Tahoma's final score was solid, but left room for improvement by the remaining competitors. Ahot shot next, his legendary accuracy serving him well at the extended distance. All 3 of his arrows found the target, with 2 striking the center rings in displays of precision that reinforced his reputation. His score surpassed Tahoma's, setting a new standard that would be difficult to match. Nalish followed with arrows that seemed to defy the physical limitations of traditional bows. His shots flew with power and accuracy that spoke of perfect technique refined through decades of practice. 2 arrows struck the center, while his third missed by the narrowest of margins. His score edged slightly ahead of Ahot's, creating tension as the competition moved toward its climax. Kurik approached the shooting line with visible determination to prove that his objections to Rose's participation had been justified by superior traditional skill. His first arrow struck the center of the target with authority, drawing cheers from supporters who shared his views about preserving competitions for full-blooded Apache archers. His second shot matched the first, and his confidence grew visibly as he prepared for his final arrow. The crowd sensed that Keurig was shooting the round of his life, potentially setting a score that would be difficult for anyone to surpass. His third arrow flew straight and true, striking so close to center that the judges needed to examine the target carefully before announcing his score. The total placed him well ahead of all previous competitors, and he turned from the shooting line with obvious satisfaction. His performance had been exceptional by any standard, and his supporters began celebrating what seemed like certain victory. Then it was Rose's turn. The crowd fell silent as the young archer stepped forward, her competition bow steady in her hands despite the enormous pressure of the moment. She could feel thousands of eyes upon her, judging not just her individual performance, but the wisdom of allowing an outsider, even one with Apache blood, to compete in their most sacred traditions. Nashoba stood at the edge of the crowd, his face a mask of calm that concealed his own nervous tension. He had taught Rose everything he knew, prepared her as thoroughly as possible, and crafted the finest bow of his career for this moment. Now it was up to her to demonstrate whether talent, training, and ancestral heritage could combine to achieve something truly extraordinary. Rose knocked her first arrow, feeling the sacred feathers brush against her fingers as she found her grip. The wind had picked up since Keurig's shots, creating more challenging conditions that would test every aspect of her preparation. She drew the bow smoothly, finding her anchor point and feeling the perfect balance that Nashoba had built into the weapon. The target seemed impossibly small at such distance, but Rose had learned to trust her instincts rather than overthinking the technical challenges. She released the arrow with confidence born from months of intensive practice, watching it arc high against the blue sky before descending toward the distant target. The arrow struck the center ring with a solid thunk that carried clearly in the still air. The crowd stirred with surprise and growing excitement as they realized that the young archer was matching the performance of the most experienced competitors. Rose's second arrow faced even more challenging wind conditions, requiring split-second timing to find the brief moment when conditions were optimal for a perfect shot. She waited patiently, drawing on the lessons about patience that had been among Nashoba's earliest teachings. When the wind stilled, she released her second arrow with absolute confidence. It flew even truer than the first, striking so close to dead center that the judges would need to measure carefully to determine exact placement. The crowd's excitement was building towards something approaching frenzy as they witnessed what might be a historic performance. For her final shot, Rose faced the most pressure she had ever experienced. The wind was gusting unpredictably. The target seemed to shimmer in the heat, and she could feel the weight of expectations from her adopted tribe, her ancestral heritage, and her own determination to prove herself worthy of everything she had been taught. She closed her eyes for a moment, calling on the spiritual disciplines that Ayana had taught her, connecting herself to the larger rhythms of nature that governed all successful archery. When she opened her eyes again, the target seemed clearer, the wind more predictable, and her purpose more focused than ever before. Rose drew the competition bow for the final time, feeling its perfect responsiveness and the sacred power of the feathers that guided her arrow. Everything Nashoba had taught her, everything she had learned about Apache traditions, everything she had inherited from Morning Star's bloodline, all of it came together in the single moment of ultimate focus. Arrow left her bow with a sound like a whispered prayer. The arrow flew with a perfection that seemed to transcend the physical limitations of wood, sinew, and feathers. It traced a flawless arc through the desert air, riding the wind currents like an eagle in flight, carrying with it the hopes of an adopted tribe and the dreams of ancestors long departed. Time seemed suspended as hundreds of eyes tracked the arrow's flight toward the distant target. Rose remained in her shooting stance, bow still extended, watching her final shot with the same focused intensity that had guided its release. The sacred feathers had done their work, and now only gravity and destiny would determine the outcome. The Arrow struck the target with a sound that seemed to echo off the canyon walls, a solid, definitive impact that spoke of perfect placement. For a moment, the crowd remained silent, uncertain of what they had witnessed. Then the judges began running toward the target to examine the results, and excited conversations erupted throughout the gathering. Rose lowered her bow slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settling around her like a physical presence. She had given everything she possessed to those 3 arrows, drawing on every lesson Nashoba had taught her, every technique she had mastered, and every drop of Apache blood that flowed through her veins. Nashoba reached her side before the judges had completed their examination, his weathered face showing pride that went beyond words. "You shot like Morning Star herself was guiding your arrows," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. The formal announcement came from Manolito, whose voice carried across the ceremonial ground with the authority of his position and the wonder of what he was declaring. "The 3rd arrow of Rose, granddaughter of Morning Star, has not only struck the center of the target, but has achieved a distance and accuracy that surpasses the previous record by a measure that will be remembered for generations." The crowd erupted in celebration that transcended tribal boundaries and previous objections to Rose's participation. Apache bands that had questioned whether an outsider should compete now cheered for the young archer who had just demonstrated that Apache heritage could manifest in the most unexpected ways. But Manolito's announcement was not complete. "The judges have made a discovery that adds even greater significance to this achievement. The final arrow did not merely break the existing record, it destroyed the target entirely, splitting the wooden post and embedding itself so deeply that it cannot be removed without damaging the arrow itself." Rose felt her knees weaken as the full implications of what she had accomplished began to sink in. She had not simply won the competition or even broken an ancient record. She had achieved something that would become legendary in its own right, a feat that would be carved into the record stones and remembered in Apache oral tradition for generations to come. The formal ceremony that followed was unlike anything in the recent history of the tribal games. Rose was presented with victory, feathers that marked not just competition success but recognition as a master archer whose skills ranked among the finest in Apache history. These ceremonial feathers, blessed through ancient rituals and earned through unprecedented achievement, would mark her status within the community for the rest of her life. Kurik, whose opposition to her participation had been the most vocal, approached Rose with the dignity that Apache tradition demanded even in defeat. "Your arrows flew true," he said simply, offering the respect that one warrior owed another after honest competition. "I was wrong to question your right to be here." The acknowledgement from her strongest critic meant more to Rose than the victory itself. It represented final acceptance from those who had doubted not her abilities, but her place within Apache traditions. She had proven through performance that heritage could transcend bloodlines and that dedication could earn what birth alone could not guarantee. As evening approached and the formal competitions concluded, Rose found herself surrounded by tribal members who wanted to examine the bow that had produced such remarkable shooting and hear her thoughts about the techniques that had made her success possible. She answered their questions with the same humility that had marked her entire journey from grief-stricken orphan to legendary archer. "I had the finest teacher," she said repeatedly, gesturing toward Nashoba, "and I was blessed to reclaim skills that my ancestors never truly lost." The celebration continued long into the night, with traditional dances and storytelling that placed Rose's achievement within the larger context of Apache history and legend. But for Rose herself, the most meaningful moment came when Tacheda presented her with a special honor that recognized not just her archery skills, but her complete integration into the tribal community. "You have proven that the blood of Morning Star runs strong in your veins," the elder said, placing a necklace of sacred stones around Rose's neck. You have brought honor to your ancestors and hope to your people. You are no longer the granddaughter of Mountain Jack learning Apache ways. You are Rose of the Morning Star clan, keeper of traditions that will never be lost as long as you live. To pass them on. The victory feathers that adorned Rose's hair caught the firelight as she listened to this formal recognition, their significance extending far beyond mere competition success to represent her complete transformation from outsider to honored tribal member. The record arrow that had made this transformation possible would remain embedded in the ruined target, a permanent monument to what was possible when natural talent, intensive training, and ancestral heritage united in pursuit of excellence. As the celebration continued around her, Rose felt the profound satisfaction that came from honoring not just her own dreams, but the dreams of those who had come before her and those who would follow after. She had reclaimed her place among the Pelivan, Apache people, and in doing so, had helped them reclaim their faith in the enduring power of their traditions. 5 years had passed since the tribal games that transformed Rose from an orphaned outsider into a legendary Apache archer, and the desert morning found her in the familiar position of instructor, watching a new generation of students struggle with the fundamentals that had once challenged her as well. The teaching arrow she had crafted bore the same attention to detail that Nashoba had brought to her own equipment, each one perfectly balanced and designed to help young archers develop proper technique. "Patience, Ayana," Rose said gently to the 8-year-old girl who was growing frustrated with her inability to hit the target consistently. "The bow will teach you what you need to know, but only if you listen to what it's trying to tell you." There, irony was not lost on Rose, that she was now passing on the same lessons that had once seemed impossibly difficult to her own eager but impatient mind. The circle of teaching and learning continued, each generation building on the wisdom of those who came before, while adding their own understanding to the accumulated knowledge of the tribe. Nashoba, now showing the silver hair and careful movements of advancing age, watched from the shade of a ramada as Rose worked with the young archers. The pride in his eyes had never dimmed, though it had evolved from the satisfaction of a teacher whose student had exceeded all expectations to the deeper contentment of someone who had witnessed tradition successfully transmitted to worthy hands. "She teaches better than I ever did," he confided to Cocheda, who at her advanced age spent most of her time in advisory roles rather than active instruction. "She teaches differently," Cocheda corrected with the wisdom that came from observing multiple generations of Apache educators. "You taught technique and discipline. She teaches possibility and dreams. Both are necessary for complete education." Rose's integration into tribal life had been so complete that visiting Apache bands sometimes forgot she had not been born among them. Her marriage to Dakota 3 years earlier had been celebrated as the union of two accomplished young people rather than the unusual pairing of an outsider with a tribal member. Their first child, a son they named Nashoba in honor of Rose's teacher, showed early signs of inheriting both his mother's determination and his father's natural athleticism. The archery program that Rose had developed went far beyond simple target practice, incorporating lessons about tribal history, traditional crafts, and the spiritual dimensions of Apache hunting culture. Their students learned to make their own arrows, understand the properties of different woods and feathers, and appreciate the ceremonies that connected their shooting to the larger rhythms of Apache life. "Why do we pray before we shoot?" asked Chaska, now a teenager whose early skepticism about Rose had transformed into deep respect for her teaching methods. "Because archery is not just about hitting targets," Rose replied, repeating words that Nashoba had spoken to her years earlier. "It's about connecting your spirit to the spirit of the weapon, the arrow, and everything you hope to achieve. Without that connection, you're just throwing pointed sticks." The teaching arrows that filled Rose's quiver represented more than just practice equipment. They were symbols of continuity, links between the ancient knowledge that Nashoba had shared with her and the future understanding that her students would carry forward. Each arrow had been crafted with the same care and spiritual attention that had marked the weapons used in the legendary competition that established her reputation. Rose's own children had begun showing interest in archery, though she was careful not to pressure them into following her path. She understood that each generation needed to find its own relationship with tribal traditions, building on what came before while adapting to the changing circumstances that would define their own era. "Will you teach me to shoot like you did at the games?" asked little Nashoba, his eyes bright with the hero worship that children reserve for their most admired adults. "I will teach you to shoot like yourself," Rose replied, kneeling to meet his eyes at his own level. "The goal is not to copy what others have done, but to discover what you are capable of achieving." As the afternoon training session concluded, and her students dispersed to their evening responsibilities, Rose found herself walking the familiar paths of the canyon that had become her true home. The record stones that commemorated her historic achievement had been joined by newer monuments celebrating other accomplishments. But her arrow's mark remained the standard against which future archers measured their own aspirations. Dakota joined her for their customary evening walk, their conversation ranging over the daily concerns of tribal life and the larger questions about how to preserve Apache culture while adapting to an increasingly complex world. Their partnership had become a model for other young couples, demonstrating how traditional relationships could thrive when both partners brought complete commitment to their shared community. The children from the eastern bands arrived today, Dakota mentioned as they paused to watch the sunset paint the canyon walls in familiar shades of gold and crimson. 3 families who heard about our archery program and wanted their young people to learn from the teacher who broke the ancient records. Rose nodded, unsurprised by the news. Her reputation had spread far beyond their immediate tribal territory, creating opportunities for cultural exchange that strengthened connections between Apache communities that had sometimes been isolated from each other. As darkness settled over the canyon and the familiar sounds of evening camp life began around them, Rose reflected on the journey that had brought her from grief-stricken orphan to respected teacher and tribal member. The teaching arrows in her quiver represented not just her current role, but her ongoing commitment to ensuring that the skills and wisdom she had received would continue flowing to future generations. Nashoba approached them as they made their way back toward the central fire, his movement still strong despite his advancing years. "Good session today," he observed, settling beside them on the smooth rocks that served as informal seating around the evening gathering place. "They're learning," Rose agreed, slowly but with proper foundation. "As it should be," Nashoba replied. "The best lessons take time to fully understand." The fire crackled with familiar warmth as tribal members gathered for the evening meal and conversation that bound the community together. Rose took her place in the circle with the easy confidence of someone who belonged completely, her teaching arrows propped beside her as symbols of the responsibilities she had willingly accepted. Young Ayana, the student who had struggled with patience during the day's lesson, approached Rose with a carefully crafted arrow that she had been working on for weeks. "Is this one ready for shooting?" she asked hopefully. Rose examined the arrow with the same careful attention that Nashoba had once given to her own early efforts. The balance was good, the fletching properly secured, and the point correctly aligned. "This is excellent work," she pronounced, handing the arrow back with genuine approval. "You're ready to test it tomorrow." As the evening progressed and stories were shared around the fire, Rose found herself thinking about Morning Star, the great-grandmother whose forced separation from Apache life had created the circumstances that led to Rose's own unexpected return. The teaching arrows she had crafted carried forward not just technical knowledge, but the spiritual understanding that connected each generation to those who had come before. The stars emerged in the clear desert sky, the same stars that had watched over Apache people for countless generations and would continue their vigil long after Rose's own arrows had been added to the archaeological record of her people's enduring presence in this harsh and beautiful land. When the fire finally burned low and families began retiring to their dwellings, Rose gathered her teaching arrows and prepared for rest, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to pass on the wisdom she had received. The circle of teaching and learning would continue, each student eventually becoming a teacher, each arrow finding its mark in the larger target of cultural preservation and tribal continuity. The teaching arrows rested beside her sleeping place, ready for another day of instruction, their presence a quiet promise that the traditions Nashoba had shared with her would never be lost as long as there were willing hands to draw the bowstring and open hearts to receive the deeper lessons that archery could teach.